Welcome back to another episode of Attention Elsewhere. I'm Alasdair, and I'm joined by my co-host Eli as we draw upon our own hang-ups, predilections, and obsessions to discuss and spotlight underappreciated, overlooked, and/or up-and-coming entertainment media, including books, games, films, manga, manhwa, and everything in between. No medium is off-limits, and everything is worth our attention.
For today's episode, we'll be discussing a piece of prose fiction that, in my opinion, belongs to an entire canon of overlooked media, translated literature. And by translated literature, I mean specifically works written and published not in English, but then later translated to English. Because let's be honest, the English language dominates the international book industry, and just because a book gets translated to English later does not mean that it is given equal attention by the industry nor by readers, as does works originally written and published in English. And the book that we will be discussing today is a book called Oromay by Baalu Girma, an Ethiopian classic written in 1983 and then translated decades later in 2025
by Mesfin, Felleke, Yirgu,
and David DeGusta. And Alasdair, since I picked this piece of media to discuss, it is your turn to summarize it.
I really appreciate that. That's so kind of you. I'm going to start with the quick and dirty history lesson, which is going to be the shortest version of Ethiopian revolutionary history, and then we'll actually get into Oromay itself. So, on September 12th of 1974, the Derg, which would go on to become a military junta, made up of junior and mid-level officers of the Imperial Ethiopian Army and members of the police, as well as support by widespread mass protests, overthrew the government and deposed the emperor of the Ethiopian Empire. The monarchy was abolished, and the Derg established Ethiopia as a socialist state, under a military-led provisional government chaired by a man that we will mostly just refer to as the chairman throughout, but whose actual name is Mengistu Haile Mariam, I believe. What followed was a campaign of political repression in which the Derg sought to sort of wipe out any political opponents. And this included the imprisonment and execution of tens of thousands of people without trial. This campaign, just in general, was met with widespread resistance, both within and without the nation. But for our purposes, we'll mostly be focusing on the armed separatist movement known as the EPLF, or the Eritrean People's Liberation Front. At the time, Eritrea was a state of Ethiopia, but has since regained its independence. Then in 1982, the Derg would declare the start of the Red Star Campaign, a military, economic, and cultural offensive meant to crush the EPLF and bring Eritrea back under Ethiopian control. It was a major undertaking. The Derg went so far as to temporarily move the capital of Ethiopia from Addis Ababa to the Eritrean city of Asmara, as well as relocating thousands of government and military personnel. And as well as that, artists, writers, journalists, and others all meant to sort of bolster the messaging and the propaganda of the campaign. But it failed. And if anything, it actually went on to bolster the strength of the EPLF. And that's where our intrepid author comes into the picture. So Baalu Girma, the writer of Oromay, was a prominent journalist throughout both the reign of the last emperor of Ethiopia and then under the Derg. But it was under the Derg that he actually assumed the role of Minister of Information and became the writer for many of Mengistu's speeches during both the Ogaden War and the Red Star Campaign. Or, to put it another way, he was the media and propaganda figurehead of a violent totalitarian regime that would later be charged with genocide. Of course, he was also a novelist, and though his most famous work is certainly Oromay, it was not his only one. In fact, his previous novels, of which we have not read, but we've at least read a little bit about, could very much be read as Derg propaganda, which is what sets Oromay apart. So, with the briefest of histories out of the way, what is Oromay? So Oromay follows Sege Haile Mariam, who, at least in my words, is a womanizer, a journalist, and who else but the Minister of Information of the Derg. Are we seeing the parallels yet? He and the rest of the Derg leadership are about to fly to Asmara, capital of Eritrea, to set in motion the Red Star campaign. But Sege leaves behind a fiancée, a woman named Roman Hillitwork, promising he will return in 3 months so they can be wed. But Roman has this sort of suspicion, even at that stage, that Sege is going to find another woman, and she's not wrong. His arrival in Asmara is hardly sensational. Rather, it's filled with meetings upon meetings, with the chairman mostly just breathing down his neck about cameras that they need to film the Red Star campaign. The hope is to turn most of it into propaganda footage to use against the EPLF, as well as working on a better jamming system to block out the enemy's propaganda. I think, as Sege himself says, what they're waging is a war of words, at least on his part. But what sort of really kicks off the novel and where this gets really interesting is a party that is being held by his friend Solomon, who is I think the chief of operations in Eritrea. The party is mostly made up of Derg officials. They're all sort of gathered, I think, the night after their arrival to just sort of like celebrate and just have like a moment of relaxation, basically, after everything they've been going through. But Solomon has also invited a few defectors from the EPLF, including a really prominent one who's, I think, just defected in the last month or so, whose name is Silai Barai, who is accompanied by a woman named Fiammetta the Fly, an Asmaran woman with many admirers on either side of the conflict. Sege, of course, is immediately infatuated with her, and they hit it off, promising to sort of exchange numbers and talk later. I'm gonna try to just shorten the sort of center of this novel down to the fact that it feels a hell of a lot like a Cold War thriller, and it is. Asmara is basically feels like a mini Berlin, with spies, journalists, of course, and then others all working for and against each other, and sort of trying to push and pull between the Derg and the EPLF. But sort of the big talking points that we need to hit is that it's pretty quickly revealed to us that Silai, codename Oromay, is a traitor. He is not actually supporting the Derg despite his messaging. He is working for the EPLF to undermine Red Star campaign from within, and he's working with several insurgent cells within the city to make that happen. We also learn that he is working for a man who is only known as the bureaucrat, a sort of elusive, shadowy figure who's supposedly, I think, in charge of the EPLF, but we don't know very much about him. While many do sort of believe the story that Silai is telling them, so most of the Derg seem to be largely on board with this man, there are people like Betru Tesema, who is the director of public safety, i.e. the Derg's counterintelligence, essentially, who believe that Silai is spying on them, working for the enemy. And he asks Sege to sort of keep an eye out for anything suspicious. On the side of that, though, Sege is forming a relationship with Fiammetta, and while it's a passionate affair, he's pretty sure that she's still holding on to secrets of her own, things that would help the Derg in this campaign. That, and Sege, as he spends more time in Asmara, starts to notice the cracks in the Derg leadership. He starts to take notice of people who he thinks are maybe spies or traitors, and also people who are just not good at their jobs. So he's identifying weaknesses within that system, though he doesn't really bring it up. But the book takes a pretty serious change in the last third or so when Sege decides to go with the soldiers on the first major military offensive against the EPLF. He accompanies a friend of his, Colonel Wolde Taraku, a war hero and a leader of the elite battalion known as the Red Boots, into combat, hoping to sort of document their valiant and heroic efforts. And they go to capture a peak known as, I think it's 1702, which is a well-fortified natural roadblock held by the EPLF, and supposedly a key to the offensive's success. He does, however, leave things with Fiammetta at sort of a bad point. Neither of them is really willing to be genuine with the other, and it's sort of falling apart. But what really matters here is that what Sege witnesses is not at all what he expects. It doesn't take on the form of like a heroic, a valiant effort. It is a grueling, miserable war of attrition. With, as I think this is a direct quote from him, saying brother killing brother, until at last the Red Boots manage to capture the peak and also garner some secrets. Wolde manages to actually find information on one of the insurgents that is killed, firmly stating that Soleil is a traitor. That said, this moment of triumph is immediately undercut as the Ethiopian military command requests that the Red Boots and other Ethiopian forces pull out of the location, realizing that they've left themselves open to a counterattack. The colonel, recognizing just how many of his men have died for this peak and sort of taking a moment to sort of honor their sacrifice, decides to hold it at all costs, but he sends Sege away. I'm saying that he's the person that has to document the history of this moment, and also to carry back information on Soleil. So despite sort of his own feelings, Sege really wants to stay. He leaves and he returns to Asmara. Wolde is most likely killed. We don't have confirmation of it, but it's pretty certain that's what happens there. But when Sege returns to Asmara, he is reunited with his fiancée, who is really quick to notice that Sege has been pursuing another woman. She finds a mixtape of Fiammetta's in his room. She breaks off the relationship. Good on her. And so instead he goes to find Fiammetta. But failing to do so, he returns to his office, and there he finds a letter from her, finally revealing her sort of role in all of this. What we're told basically is that Sege, as one of the prominent Derg officials, has been targeted by the EPLF for assassination, and she was meant to lead him into a trap. But in revealing that, she's signed her own death warrant, and she's killed before he can sort of save her, or anyone else can save her. So what should be a moment of climax, the discovery of the spy ring, the arrest of Soleil and his compatriots, all of this is really undermined by this tragedy that Fiammetta has died to save his life. And so the final passages of the book are dedicated to both her funeral and Sege's own suffering. That's my summary of it. I'm going to say that the part that we're missing, of course, is that this is a Romana clef. It is a story that uses real people under pseudonyms in part of the fiction, essentially. So what Baalu Girma here is recanting, and we don't know, how much is fiction and how much is not, is his own experience in Eritrea and his own experience of the Red Star campaign. But what we do know is that on its publication, the book was censored, and most of the copies were pulped. The few that remained were passed around, photocopied, and shared across the nation. And while Baalu Girma was removed from his position in the Derg, I think it's 6 or 7 months later, he disappears. And while there are many rumors and sort of bits about is he still, living somewhere, the most likely explanation is that the Derg had him assassinated. So yeah, that's my however long summary.
Necessarily long.
Anything you want to add?
You covered everything really well, but I do have one nitpicky comment that will probably lead us somewhere, so I'm going to place it. You did excellently. My comment is truly nitpicky. You claimed that Fiammetta was killed before anybody had a chance to save her, but the director of public safety, Betru, admits that he and his men were watching. Director Betru admits this shamelessly to Sege. He says something to the effect of, Comrade Sege, at no time were we negligent. We have had the Paradiso, which is kind of like a coffee bar where a lot of the drama and the spying takes place. We've had the Paradiso under strict round-the-clock surveillance. At any point, we could have easily broken down the door and entered. But we have to be very careful not to make a move that isn't fully thought through so we don't tip off the other conspirators. Blah, 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 blah. When we take action, it has to be a killing blow. So they admit to tossing Fiammetta under the bus. And then to cap it off, towards the end, I don't think it's Betru himself. I think it's another character. I think it's Solomon, maybe. Speaks at her funeral, painting the situation as a moment of like self-sacrifice, which, yes, it can be read that way, but what is very carefully not said is that they could have intervened at any time, but they decided to sacrifice her.
So just to make this even better, the line that you were referring to, I found it is actually from Betru, right to Sege, in which he says, "Faced with something as devastating as this, you must stay strong. It took courage to do what she did." Her sacrifice, which is specifically for Sege, it is not for the Derg. Like, she just cares about him, is painted as this, like, patriotic choice, which is how, other deaths throughout this novel are also painted, is like, this is, it is a horrible loss of life, but hey, at least they did it for something they believed in.
Yeah, I want to latch on to the word patriotic, which I think is namely the quality of self-sacrifice. Because we have another heroic character who is literally called a hero multiple times, and that is Captain Walde, the character who dies on the mountain, makes his final stand, and boots Sege off the mountain to save his life, as well as inform the military leaders of trails all around. That guy not only dies in a moment of pointless self-sacrifice, because I believe the mountain is still overrun. In fact, all of the soldiers are described as characters who are willing to give their lives for the cause, which makes them the noblest of characters. And during the speech at Fiammetta's funeral, she too is likened to the soldier. The language they use to describe her self-sacrifice is very similar to the language used to describe a soldier's self-sacrifice. And yet, what I find fascinating is that both her and Colonel Wolde die for reasons that have less to do with the aims of the campaign and more to do with self-centered motivations that in some cases, like Fiammetta's, directly reject the aims of the Red Star campaign. Because in her letter, she's very critical of the Red Star campaign from a woman's perspective. I cannot remember if Colonel Wolde is directly critical of the Red Star campaign. Many of the soldiers under his command are.
He never comes right out and says it. And honestly, in most cases, this book doesn't go for that sort of critique. But there is a moment when he and Sege are talking before they leave camp to attack the peak, where he sort of lays out his understanding and saying, like, he's fought for the Derg for many years, and he's fought for Ethiopia. He believes in what they've laid out as the path for Ethiopia, like a socialist nation. He believes in that, and he has sort of the theory to back it up. One of the really interesting things about Wolde is he seems to be one of the few that has, like, read Marx, read other philosophers, understands and has, like, taken that and sort of applied it to what he wants to see out of Ethiopia. But he recognizes that, like, man is fallible, is essentially what I think he comes down on, is that the goals and the objectives of the campaign are honorable things that are worth fighting for, but that the people behind it, the people in power, are not always there because they deserve it, and not always the right people for the job, and that there is corruption amongst those ranks. So I think he takes a sort of similar position as his soldiers, which is like, we fight for a good cause, but that good cause has bad leaders.
Which I think is an accurate description of the real history. Leaders were not just corrupt, but went out of their way to prevent qualified leaders from taking places next to them for fear that their excellence would reveal their incompetence.
And I want to come back to Wolde for a second, because I think he demonstrates that through the fact that his sacrifice is one that he makes on his own terms. He's, told to do this thing. He's told to take the peak. He does it at great loss of life. And then he is told to retreat. And that's the moment where he chooses not to follow orders, but he's following like his own self-interests, which is to honor the death of the other Red Boots on this mountain. I guess I just want to focus on both that sacrifice and also Wolde maybe being one of the most clear-eyed characters when it comes to what the Derg actually is, and ask, in context of both him and Fiammetta, why are Wolde and his soldiers the ones that seem to be most conscious of the fact that the Derg as a governmental body is failing, but still willing to die for it?
Well, I have a two-pronged answer. I'll start with what I think the book is trying to do, and then if I remember, I will end with what the book fails to consider. Sege himself makes it very clear that the people whom deserve the most recognition are the soldiers on the ground whose agonizing back and forth with the enemy are what actually gain the movement any ground, literally gaining ground. And that if the success of the Red Star campaign rests upon the eradication of the enemy, then who is the tool that will carry out the eradication? It's the soldier at risk of his own life. So, in a sense, it's the soldiers who are actually doing the work, despite this book's earlier assertions that all the directors and even Sege's own role are of utmost importance. But, when it comes down to it, none of them would succeed if the soldiers did not lay the groundwork by getting rid of the bodies of their opponents. As for why they're the most clear-eyed, feel free to disagree with me, but I think that the soldiers' frequent discussions and explanations to Sege's questions about death and fearing death might provide the answer, as well as tie back to the very title of this book, Oromay, which, according to the book itself and its translators, means done, finished, the end, it's over, and is often evoked by Fiammetta in a kind of sardonic sense. I guess you could say, if you're being cute, that facing your own death constantly really puts life into perspective. The individual foot soldier who has no access to the military generals and other high-ranking leaders can maybe piece together the clues of their own life to build a picture. Maybe not individually, but that's where Sege comes in. He talks to many soldiers, and for the benefit of the audience, starts to piece together a more accurate portrayal of the military campaign as it is. As for how that relates to the title, well, a couple of times, in fact, actually at the very beginning, there's a line that echoes the very final line of this book. The final line is about Sege himself in third person, and we will get to that, don't you worry. He, meaning Sege, loves all that he finds, and he loses all that he loves. That is life, Oromay. Towards the beginning, there's a line from Sege himself in first person. Not everything goes according to plan. That's life. That's a pretty accurate depiction of everything that happens to Sege in this book. Nothing goes according to his plans anyway. He doesn't really choose anything that happens to him. He's not the master of his own destiny, really. But the soldiers and the characters who sacrifice their lives, in a sense, are. They choose where and how and under what circumstances they get to die. And even if their self-sacrifice is pointless in the broader context of things, they're the only characters who choose the one thing that they can actually fulfill, which ironically is death. even Fiammetta, who's not 100% sure that she's going to die. Like, she's fairly confident, but there's always the slight chance that she could survive. Her choice to sacrifice her life does result in an actual outcome, and the outcome she desired, which is that Sege's life is saved. And good, for all intents and purposes, the assassins don't try again. So she succeeded. In that case, her sacrifice was not pointless. But Wolde and the soldiers' sacrifices were pointless. I think that maybe the difference between their sacrifices is that Fiammetta sacrificed herself out of love, whereas Wolde and the soldiers seem to have sacrificed themselves out of a sense of masculine patriotism. Not necessarily because they think it's going to save their country, but because they think that's like kind of how heroes, as you said, honor the dead, which is a very patriarchal fantasy, to go out in a blaze of glory.
The book confirms this. I was looking for the line where Sege says basically that honor and history are for the dead. They're the things rewarded to the dead, is, being remembered. And so with Wolde's sacrifice, that feels like, his last line to Sege, when Sege asks, like, why do this, and also why should I leave? Wolde's final line is for history.
He says it like twice, right?
Right.
He's like, Sege, but history, man. Do I need to say it again?
He's like, do it for history. Also, I really need you to take this, like, little letter to Fiammetta, who, surprise, surprise, I was also in a relationship with for a while, but also for history. And yeah, it's the closest I think that we get to a moment that feels like something you would find in a war movie. And I don't mean a good war movie, but in one that wants to show like the bravado and heroism of the soldiers. Is like, this is meant to be this like grand moment. And of course, it's a self-sacrifice that means nothing.
This isn't the most excellent segue, but let me issue the second prong of my response. This book paints over the role of these soldiers
during the Red Terror, which had only occurred about a decade before the events of this book.
Baalu Girma really, really brushed over the brutality of that and the attacks on civilian life and the raids on villages and the rapes of a whole bunch of people. And in hindsight, the revolutionary force counterattacked with what they called the White Terror. Those guys were saints in comparison.
I think it's Betru that says this, but it might also be Solomon. Relatively early in the book, there was a moment where one of the two dudes is talking about Asmara right after sort of the revolution, saying, there was bodies in the streets, and each morning people would wake up in fear of like who has died tonight under specifically like the Ethiopian army's occupation. But the novel seems to take the position, or at least Baalu Girma seems to take the position that like that's the past. Like, oh, that was like not a great moment for us, but like we're civilized now, or we've figured it out now, and we don't do that anymore. And the Red Star campaign is supposedly meant to be like the moralist version of this, where it's like we are uplifting the people and also annihilating the insurgents.
I will slightly disagree that it may not be Baalu Girma himself who believes this, but it's definitely Sege, who is quite literally the minister of propaganda or the director of public relations. I don't fucking know, but he does the propaganda, and Sege seems to be the sort of character to believe his own bullshit. Like he seems to genuinely believe this, that like, oh, we're gonna move on from this. History is only useful to us so long as it like uplifts our present day actions. Although I do want to remember and just to remind that this book was published during a period of like extremely strict censorship. Nevertheless, he does not come for the soldiers. Like, I'm just a little surprised by that. He subtly critiques like other groups, but not soldiers.
Yeah. No, I was just gonna add on to it that despite this book coming out, under intense censorship, or under a time of intense censorship, Betru, who I think there's a quote from the actual man who Betru is based on, saying that he recognized himself in its pages, has an actual literal torturer as one of his, three besties who he works with, who, don't worry, he is a torturer and he does like to torture people, but he's also got a family.
Yeah, and that disturbs Betru the character. Like, how, man, you have such a great work-life balance.
And he couldn't torture Fiammetta.
Yeah, because she was just so a manic pixie dream girl. He couldn't handle it. Like every time Fiammetta's laments that she's becoming a more serious person and that her frivolities as a younger woman make her sick to her stomach now. I'm like, girl, it saved your life, probably. It impressed the family, man.
She was just in prison making little flower crowns and going around being called the queen of the prison.
And everybody's like, what the fuck? This woman ain't right. Let's not mess with her.
Yeah. But I do agree that Sege, at least, though it does seem like also Baalu Girma, are kind of unwilling, to critique the role of soldiers.
But I feel like that we should really wrestle with why at least the soldiers are not subject to the same criticism. Yes, we have the torturer, but he's in a position of power. Like he's the head of a prison, whereas the soldiers are literally foot soldiers. And although Colonel Wolde is a colonel, he eats with them, he sleeps with them, he suffers with them. He doesn't treat himself as greater than his soldiers.
Anything that he would ask his soldiers to do, he would do himself.
And better.
Like moving a truck, basically.
Yeah, it's kind of remarkable. The stories of his heroism before the events of this book starts. Like Sige's got that mad bromance for Wolde.
Sege would have so much better of a romantic life if he was just with Wolde. This man should not be near women.
The seeds between these two of like, is there anything gayer than friendship? Is there anything gayer than dying for another man?
Pushing him off the mountain and being like, no, like, I'm gonna die here, but you better live. You gotta write about me. Yeah.
Anyway,
Where were we?
why the soldiers?
Why the soldiers?
It would upset the theme of self-sacrifice if the characters who, I mean, realistically, risk the most, literally their lives, were also morally corrupt characters. It'd be interesting, but can this book support that? In a book that is also arguing on the opposite side of the coin that the self-centeredness of the officials leads to the corruption, leads to the failure of this once very idealistic and morally appreciable campaign to improve the lives of the people and usher in socialism.
I think the soldiers are also given that level of respect within Oromay, or that level of like sort of you are not to blame for everything, in order to equalize them with the enemy. There is so much in that chapter of storming the peak where Sege is going, like we're all Ethiopians and we're all fighting for different reasons, but we're like dying for our various causes, but we all die the same. So it seems to be used also as a way to go like the insurgents, who are also soldiers, though, obviously in sort of a different role, are painted as just the same as the Ethiopian army. I think that's important in some ways, especially at the time that this comes out, to go, hey, the people that we're killing aren't any different than us. And while I have some problems with the whole, like, I don't know, parallel that's being drawn between, like, soldier and freedom fighter, I feel like the point being made by Oromay there is important.
Which would, in my opinion, certainly piss off censors to draw parallels between, your own group and the other group, which you sought to eradicate completely.
Yeah.
So even just the tiniest bit of empathy would be enough to try to scour this book and its author from the face of the earth.
Knowing the history, it's impossible to read this book and not look for the moments that probably got like Baalu Girma in trouble. And a lot of this book is a pretty subtle critique that anyone with half a brain is probably still going to pick up on. But one of the first moments to really stand out to me, and there's some good stuff before this as well, is when Felleke meets Eli for the first time, and they have a talk about what is the right term to use for insurgents turned defectors. In Eli is. Do you remember the term or where this is? I'd actually like to read it out if.
Stray dog or something was the term that Sege used on like television or on a radio program to the public. Yeah, he was really butthurt about it.
Yes.
Kept bringing it up too. What a petty man.
Oh yeah, right at the end, he's like, right before he leaves the party, he's like, stray dog. Also, Soleil and Walde like complimenting each other. It's so cute.
It's like, yeah, you're real good at the murder.
Here it is. Soleil responds to Sege saying, "Why do you say on TV that insurgents who defect are like stray dogs crawling back home? We are not dogs. We are human beings. Defectors have it hard enough already. Separatist sympathizers spit on us in the streets, in bars. The insurgency's radio station calls us traitors and selfish cowards. The government says they welcome us back, but I doubt they'll ever really trust us. And then you journalists compare us to stray dogs. What does that even mean? Once a traitor, always a traitor?"
Yeah, actually.
In Soleil's case, yeah. But there are other defectors amongst this group at the party that, don't speak on it so much, but it's clear that that term is sort of like also bothering them. And so I think it's really telling for a book that did manage to get through the censors, but was then pulled, that within the first 100 or so pages, our main character is going, "Hey, I'm sorry that I called you subhuman."
Sorry that I used a metaphor.
But in some ways, like quite literally going, "Sorry that we did not treat you as people."
Now might be a good time to pivot
Yeah.
and latch on to Sege's role in the story as a journalist. And I am asking you, the journalist, how'd you feel?
Former journalist.
You can take the journal out of the ist, but not the ist out of the journal. How did it make you feel?
We'll start with the statement that I think that we're going to have to reckon with a bit, which is that I don't know if Sege is what I would call a journalist. In sort of the same way as that I wouldn't call like a Fox News pundit or a journalist. He's a propagandist. That's his job. But I really hesitate to believe that the character that we are shown is actually a journalist. There are moments, I think there are moments where he is shown doing the work of a journalist, i.e. going out and talking to people and trying to piece a story together. But his like moment to moment thinking is like, how do I make the Derg look good? And going back to the party that seems to start all of this, the EPLF portray the Derg as people who torture any insurgents that come to them. Like, defectors are all treated sort of the same, is to be like tortured for information and usually killed. And so Sege, on seeing Salai or hearing that he's going to be meeting Salai, is like, I can see it already. The title of my next segment, like the Merciful Campaign. That makes me kind of mad.
In your opinion, what should journalism be? And then does this book agree with you? It's just that Sege is too blinded by his role as a propagandist to come out and fully acknowledge it.
I believe that journalism should, and this is the really like idealist version of this, be a space to tell stories truthfully and correctly. And it's the correctly part that I think a lot of people get hung up on, as well as like, I don't fundamentally believe in this idea of journalism should be unbiased, because when you are unbiased, you are usually not holding people accountable for their actions. And that's part of, I think, journalism is holding the people above you, the people with more wealth, more power, whatever, holding those people accountable for the actions that they commit. And that's where like really great stories come from. But you have to do it right, which means that you have to be, factual. You're obviously creating a narrative, but that narrative has to be like a truthful one and not one that you are creating to benefit the people above you. And that's what we're seeing right now in the US is there's a whole bunch of organizations, some of which I used to like really respect, High Washington Post and New York Times, where there is a refusal to hold the rich and powerful accountable and a desire to protect their interests instead. And that's what Sege's role really is to me, and why it rubs me the wrong way within his character is that that's what he's doing. Is he's protecting the other sort of officials of the Derg. His job is to make them look good. Like literally that's his job. And so for him to also say, I'm a journalist, I go, are you? And I don't know if Oromay believes that he's doing the right thing. There's clearly some respect for Sege as the main character. There's some moments where he is portrayed as he's good at what he does, but he's also a little bit foolish. But I think Oromay itself, and maybe Sege himself by the end, recognizes that what he is doing is upholding something that is collapsing and something that is being used to do damage to others.
I agree with you in that. I think Sege is not a very good journalist as like we would understand it in the Western world. There is a moment, I think it's maybe during the party. It's a conversation between Sege and the director of like economics. The economics guy makes fun of journalists and says, "You journalists always making fun of people." And then Sege responds, "How about you economists?" The economist responds, "People whose purpose in life is to change the world do not make jokes." Clearly drawing a line between economists who change the world and journalists who do not, or at least journalists like Sege. But we do see the journalistic project that Sege is in charge of being contested when he's talking to the soldiers who are delivering their individual stories, and how Sege acknowledges that these are the sorts of stories that will not get told, at least by somebody in his position, and that the stories instead that are going to get told are the broad, sweeping actions of the campaign in service of the campaign's ideals, and that if the soldiers' perspectives were to be widely disseminated, then that might pose a challenge to the very organization itself, the very organization for which they work. On the subject of storytelling, would you say that is what Girma is attempting to do, but not through any kind of journalistic form, but rather through fiction, through telling this fictional story that, clearly has its parallels and even steals from his real life experiences with real life people?
I'd agree with that in general. In fact, I'd maybe go so far as to say that Oromay feels like Baalu Girma is sort of trying to repent feels like the wrong word, but make up for his own role in this. Because he held the same position as Sege, and while, we don't know how one-to-one any of this is, but you read even a little bit about him, and it's like it was his name and his words and things like that on the flyers that they dropped on insurgents. It was his words that the chairman would use. All of these things where it's like Baalu Girma was extremely prominent in helping the Derg maintain power. And so, in a lot of ways, RMA feels like trying to reckon with that legacy and go, what was I doing as a journalist? And maybe that's a stretch. Maybe I'm pushing it too far. But that was my gut feeling on finishing it.
While we'll never know without hearing from the man himself. Perhaps we can attempt to wrestle with that question by interrogating the character called author. Literally. I think you might have maybe left this out of your summary, but there was a lot to cover. Sege may be the main narrator, not the only narrator, but we have another character who refers to themselves as the author, who interjects into the story occasionally in between parts.
Not just interjects, but guides the narrative. I'm hesitant to call the author and Baalu Girma the same person, but the few times that this book leaves Sege's perspective and takes on different ones, there's usually a section right before it where the author says, I think for the first one he goes, Sege is like sleeping now, but there are other things going on in Asmara that need our attention. Right? Like he is a guide for the reader, taking them to different scenes that are important to the overarching narrative.
And that's where we get the point of view switches as well.
Yes.
Sege's perspective is largely through first person, excluding the fairy ending, and everybody else's perspective is in third person. Although the author's perspective is also in first person.
Yes.
So, what was your impression of those moments? In particular, when the author steps outside of the role as guide and pontificates about their own role in this narrative and out of this narrative.
I feel like there might be like two answers here, and I'll start with the one that was sort of immediately apparent, which is when you introduce a character like the author to a text, you are both recognizing the nature of something as fiction, as being guided by someone else, but also saying Sege is not me. And that's pretty important to the fact that, like, this is, as I've said before, it's a roman à clef. Real people given fictive names and places in a fictive narrative, but they're still there. And so for this book to give us a character like the author, it creates that space where it's like, okay, so Sege is not Baalu Girma, even if the two of them share the same role within this Red Star campaign and within the Derg. That said, kind of pulling us back into the question of, like, what is the role of a journalist? The author is doing what I think a journalist does best, or should do best if they're good at their job. A journalist acts as a guide in telling a story. And while that story, in most cases, should be a truthful one and a piece of non-fiction, you shouldn't have to make up facts to make it work. That's the role of a journalist, is to have all the pieces so that I, as the storyteller, have all the information in front of me. I have all the pieces. I get to determine how they're arranged and what that outcome is. And so in a lot of ways, the author feels to me like the journalist that Sege wants to be, or like maybe should be.
What do you then make of author Chan referring to this puzzle of narrative as a web? Occasionally, as a web that, you can get caught in. Not just as author Chan, but also the characters can get caught in it. Yeah, right before we switch to Betru, the last line is life does not stay still. It's always moving, weaving together one existence with another to make its web. And then the story continues. Life is like a spider's web, spreading out and entangling us.
I'm going to start somewhere slightly different, and we're going to come back to this, because I think I'm pulling this together in my head, which is that between the author, and by the author I mean the character of the author within the book, maybe not necessarily Baalu Girma himself, and Sege, we have two characters that recognize history, or the role of history, differently. Sege often espouses, though I don't necessarily know if he believes, that history is not, like, important to his personal life. Like, he lives for the now. I think that that's what the character is meant to believe, but it's something that he says to himself.
Yes, he has this clear aspiration to living in the present, distancing himself specifically from like the role of the soldier in history.
And then there's the author who seems to perceive and sort of talks about it as like history is something that they are conscious of and pulling on and also looking to the future, like, but they are like outside of history.
Yes, there is a line in here where Author Chan says, I have no face and no name. I am not constrained by time or space. This is me. I have been, I am, and I will be.
So I'm going to go back and say that yes, the author is atemporal, but cognizant of time. So two characters that initially I assumed would be one and the same, i.e., I thought everything would be in sort of Sege, and I did not expect there to be the presence of like an author character, are sort of they're pitted against each other insofar as how they view the role of history. It is only after all of this has happened that it is possible to tell the story that we are holding in our hands. That's sort of what it feels like, is that whether this is Baalu Girma or the character of the author, because they have now lived it, because they are now past it, it is possible to go back, find the right pieces, and tell the right story. For Sege, it's not possible to perceive all of this at once. It's not possible to know all of this at once. But from the author's perspective, the person who is outside of time, you can look across the whole campaign, right, and pull the necessary strings in order to tell the story that you want.
This segues back into my question.
Great, good.
Strings. Strings. What an excellent word to use, because what is a web but a series of sticky strings? So I'll just pose my question again. What does it mean that Author Chan refers to this series of perspectives as a web?
Yes, I can pull this closer to the web. Sege and the other characters in this novel have their things that they get attached to. They have their things that they have attention for and the things that they miss. And so it feels in some ways as if, God, I hate myself for the metaphor that I'm going to make. If Sege is the spider, then Fiammetta is the beautiful, sumptuous fly that has been stuck in the web. And Sege has not enough attention for everything else going on around him. For instance, the giant bird coming to eat him.
Who's the bird?
The bird could be the EPLF, but it could also be the Derg. You know? The bird is going to destroy his beautiful web. But I think, while the metaphor is not great, I do think it's apt to say that each of these characters has a thing that they're sort of hung up on and they focus on, and that gets them into situations and experiences that maybe they don't want to have. There's one character who I'm gonna forget his name, but he works for Betru, who has it like really out for Soleil because Soleil killed his brother.
Tekle?
Tekle?
James
Is that right?
Bond, which is just his nickname.
That's right. Tekle. He's one of like Betru's close associates or underlings, essentially. And throughout the book, we are reminded again and again and again that his brother was killed by Soleil. And so he has this quest of revenge. He wants to be the one to bring Soleil in. He wants to be given the opportunity to do away with him or torture him. But he is a good little spy, and he does his job even outside of that. Is that like what we see with him is that he's still focused on everything else. Like even at the end, when he is in fact the one that brings Soleil in, he keeps saying, you know, I want him to give me the opportunity to do what I've been desiring to do, but he hasn't, so I will do my job, which is to bring him in unharmed, essentially. And Sege and the rest are not like this, or at least they're a little different from this, where like Sege gets caught up in Fiammetta, and because of that passionate relationship, he misses the other things that are happening. And it's only later, once that relationship starts to devolve, that he actually goes, oh shit, here's some major things that I've missed that I need to talk to Betru about and be like, hey, we have a bunch of traitors in our midst, and we missed it.
And he keeps getting Betru's voicemail in the form of his secretary, who's like, yeah, He stepped out. No, he's still out. He'll be back. Can it wait? No, I cannot take a message. Why? Security.
Yeah. And I think that fits back into this with like these are characters that are driven by different things, and those things in some cases get them into some serious trouble. And it's only the author who is not involved in their matters, is not, an actual character within that space, who is able to look at everything and go, okay, like here's actually how this fits together. He's able to perceive essentially the entire web, whereas the characters inside of it can only perceive what they are standing on and what they are looking at.
I have many a response to that. Hopefully, I will go in the order that makes the most sense. Firstly, I agree with everything you just said about webs. I just want to add a little something more. The role that a web plays in a spider's life as like a trap for prey is also significant. That, these people, according to Arthur Chan, life is like a spider's web spreading out and entangling us, not just the other characters, but Arthur Chan themselves. And I think that as one strand gets added to the web, they get tied up within the story, figuratively speaking. They're stuck. They're stuck in it. And perhaps this is not the most accurate term, but I think it gets my point across the most. There is no character who's not complicit in the entire events of this narrative, even if they're not fully involved in everything that's going on and every decision that's being made. And I think that it is important that Baalu Girma focuses upon what you could consider very small actors. Even the directors are small actors in comparison to the shadowy figure of the bureaucrat or the all-powerful chairman. The chairman who exists in the narrative, gives his speeches, even talks to Sege face to face, but it was not really a major player in this story. I don't think he really does anything that impacts the actual events of the story. He gives some very powerful speeches and he stands around looking pretty. And the bureaucrat may not even exist at all. We have no idea. The very members of the bureaucrat's organization aren't even 100% sure that he actually exists.
This is a thing that I glommed onto as I was reading this, is that both of the major power players, though again one may or may not exist, are portrayed as these like icons rather than as people. I think we were given a conversation with Soleil and some of the other spies in one of the cells talking about the bureaucrat, where they're like asking each other questions, trying to deem like who is the bureaucrat. Like even members of the EPLF do not know who the bureaucrat is, and they're trying to like create an image of this man. But it's just all like aesthetic. It's not like who is this. It's not about getting to the core of what a person is. It's like how they look. So my question that I want to sort of interject into here is, why are these such like prominent figures portrayed in this way, especially when we have Sege, who is like high enough up in the organization that he's close to the chairman?
My answer is going to be some variation on what I just said, but I'll add something new, which is I think we are both in agreement that if there is any central criticism of the actual real Dirk, it is in this way that this book portrays corrupt officials. There is something to be said about the people who carry out the will of the dictator. The dictator is powerless if they do not have people to act on their will. I think it's important to include the chairman, that the chairman is not reduced to the same shadowy figure as the bureaucrat, because A, that wouldn't be very accurate to the real life history that this book depicts, but also nobody disagrees with what the chairman says. The chairman's speeches may not actually influence the events of the narrative, but they do have an effect. They have an effect upon the characters who listen. Although there are some characters who are questioning the moral purity of the campaign, Sige and other characters at least outwardly voice that they are convinced by the political and moral ideals of the socialist revolution. They do seem to truly believe in the cause, even if they are doubting its methods. That's my take on the chairman. The bureaucrat is a little harder. I think maybe the bureaucrats secretive nature reflects something about the quote unquote insurgents organization, where the chairman represents this sort of dictatorship. The bureaucrat and other, members of this organization are in hiding. Like they can't even know each other for the sake of the success of their mission.
Yeah, I think because, I went and read a little bit more about Baalu Girma and his role as like the speechwriter for the chairman. There's certain moments in Oromay where the chairman, gives these eloquent explanations of what is the purpose of the Red Star campaign, all of this, that I can't help but go, and I don't have textual proof of this, so I'm not going to claim that, but I can't help but go, like, is this meant to be like Sege's own writing in some ways, or is this like an actual charismatic person? Do we have a distinction here of like charismatic actor, or is this like Sege almost feeding his own words back to himself?
Yeah, I think there's also no proof in text, but given that very few leaders write their own speeches,
Yeah,
even in that sense, the dictator has no real power of their own.
yeah.
Is the dictator the spider? You know what? I'm done with this metaphor. Let's move on. Let's segue. So I do want to return back a little way back to when you were talking about quote unquote James Bond, and how he, similar to characters like Betru, has a better understanding of all the context and has a sort of better grasp on the many threads of narrative, even if they don't have all the threads like Author Chan does. Some of the language you were using to describe them makes me wonder, and I am seriously asking, even though this is going to sound rhetorical. In this book, do spies make for better journalists?
Yay. Okay. Yes. This is annoying because this was also a question I was going to pose to you, but I guess you got there first, which is to say that this book, especially by including a character like Betru and his underlings within its narrative, brings spies, journalists, and propagandists all sort of together, and at times doesn't want to draw a line between them. Because Sege himself, even though many times is like, I am not a spy, I will not be a spy, I will die with a microphone in my hand because I am a journalist, is a spy. He acts as a spy throughout this narrative, but he's not trained as one, and because of that, he's not got sort of like the same information chops as them. I'm going to say that to your question, the spies in this book are the closest characters to the author, both in their ability to perceive the web, though also they are driven by certain desires, so it's still a sort of cut off version of their vision, but also in their disconnectedness from the people that they are playing with, right? Like, Betru is completely and utterly willing to sacrifice Fiammetta in order to get the spy network that is under his nose. And he doesn't have to do that. He has enough proof of it anyways. But he can't take a chance. And so she dies in what he considers like this courageous way for the country. I'm getting off topic. The point is that within a campaign that is meant to be about, hey, let's make the Derg look good, it is the spy's role to go, okay, but what's the actual story? Like, what's actually happening under our noses? And how do we piece it together in a way that makes sense? And also looking at like sporadic bits of information and going, these are connected.
And just a really quick jump in, not only piece things together so that it makes sense, but piece things together so that information can be acted upon, which seems to be fundamentally lacking in Sege's journalism, as pointed out by our smartass economics. Like,
Yeah.
you don't actually do anything, Sege, whereas I change the world.
I like that he doesn't even call him Sege, he just calls him Mr. TV. On
Mhm.
on every instance, it's like Mr. TV or Comrade TV or something like that, which is such a like brutal takedown of Sege, who so often waxes poetically about like this journalism, the spirit of journalism. And I'm like, my guy, the spies are doing a better job than you.
This is one of Sege's primary weaknesses, according to Arthur Chan. They write, Sege is in love. It brings him pleasure and pain. That is what Sege wants, a beautiful, sweet life of suffering. My guy doesn't seem to actually care that much about the project he's on. Bro just wants to have a good time.
Tekle, in many ways, feels like a mirror to Sege, at least when it comes to his relationships with women. They're both sort of addicted to this lifestyle of like going out and meeting beautiful women and then like having sex with them and probably leaving them. But only one of them is actually capable of getting like usable information out of that, and it's Tekle, and it's not Sege.
I don't know if it is Tekle or if it's Betru, but one of them comments very early on that women would make for like really, really, really good spies for their general greater access to people. In light of our conversations about spies and journalists, if women would make for really good spies, and spies are arguably better journalists in this book, or at least better at the project of journalism, then do women in this book have the best view of what's going on here? Of the two women to pick from here, one of whom is long distance.
The women in this book are particularly good at like recognizing what is going on and like how to navigate spaces and all of that, in part because neither of them is particularly invested in the actual outcome of the campaign. That's not to say that there aren't other women in Ethiopia at the time, of course, that like did deeply care about what happens, whether it's the EPLF or the Derg, but the two that we're given are people that are predominantly interested in the people that they care about. And so what they pick up on is not so much threats to like a political movement or motion, but threats to the people, right? And like they're cognizant of that space.
Which is ironically the target of the very campaign. It's a war for the hearts of the people.
Yes. The reason that they're so good at this in some respects is because Ethiopia, like a lot of nations at the time, is a deeply patriarchal society. And so to exist in that space as a woman is to exist as someone sort of like, I don't love the language for this, but as other, essentially. Like the spaces, the organizations, everything is not purpose built for women, it is purpose built for men. And we can see this just in like who's the major part of the organization. I think there might be like a couple of secretaries who are women, but the majority of people in the Derg that we are showing are men, and they're men with that patriarchal fervor that ends in them dying on stupid mountainsides. But to, go back to it, so women have to be really conscious of how they act, how they are perceived. All of that is information that they are just intaking and responding to. And I think Fiammetta is probably in some ways the best example of this, where while she is portrayed as being like a ditzy manic pixie dream girl by the text, how she actually acts, how she responds to things is so tactful and strategic. She is so careful, even in the fact that like, yeah, she, pursues different relationships and different, yeah, she's, been with people on both sides of the conflict, and she knows where that places her. She knows that she is in a strategic position in some ways, and that like the Derg obviously are going to take interest in her, and obviously the EPLF still have her in their sights and all of these, and she acts accordingly. And so when she makes the choice to be with Sege, she recognizes also in that he's in some ways, like literally his presence is a potential threat to her safety. And Roman, who is, I think, a little bit more, she's sheltered more from the effects of the actual campaign, because for the majority of the book, she is in Addis, which I think was is actually the capital of Ethiopia, but temporarily was not during that time. She's somewhat more sheltered from the actual effects of the campaign, but like Fiammetta, she's similarly brought up into a deeply patriarchal society, and so has those same instincts for being like really conscious of just everything going on around her and responding to that. So when you know, she immediately picks up on the fact that Sege has been in a relationship with another woman because he's an idiot and leaves a tape cassette like out somewhere, and she goes,
Who this?
"Who this?"
And Sege, like a dumbass,
Yeah.
is like, who what? What? How'd that get there?
Yeah. But I think that's the big thing, is that they are not acting as spies in this case, but they are excellent potential spies, and they are very much aware of the web that is being weaved in a way that like none of the men, except maybe like Betru and even him, it's like only sort of can perceive.
Firstly, I just want to jump on what you said about the ways in which Fiammetta is portrayed by the men in this book, specifically her like her many relationships with men make her into a kind of Black Widow figure, wherein the men constantly assert that she's just in it for their money, especially the money of these outsiders who bring in a lot of it, and that she is somehow representative of most of the women in the area. But what I find really interesting is that every characteristic that is lobbed at Fiammetta can be equally applied to the men, and that by the end of the story it's revealed that every characteristic she was ever accused of is falsehood, whereas those lobbed at the men are more accurate, namely loyalty and disloyalty, empathy versus heartlessness. Out of all the characters, Fiammetta is the most quote unquote loyal. She chooses to sacrifice her life for Sege's, while she's also being characterized by everybody else as the most disloyal. She has pretty poignant sense of empathy. She's really good at understanding people, which is why maybe her obsession with understanding who, like, what kind of person Roman is, and her inability to like fully wrestle with who Roman is, maybe like eats at her so much because she's usually very good at reading people.
I was mostly just going to bring up the way that she is treated and the way that she is portrayed, yeah, as you said, as a sort of Black Widow figure, is especially funny when it comes to the end. And Sege is like, when Roman figures out that he's been with another woman, she's, pretty rightfully mad at him. And his response is, "But why? It's not my fault. Like, it just happened. Like, I'm a man. I do these things."
Roman's like, Mama didn't raise an idiot.
Yeah.
Clearly your mama did, but mine didn't.
Yeah. But the fact that, like, again, this is another instance where I feel we see a divide between sort of like author and Sege, is like Sege is just like cannot conceive of the fact that he has done something wrong and is like trying to work through like where he went wrong. He's like, I thought I did, I cheated on her, right? Basically.
Which, like, he did journalism right.
Yeah. Yeah, it's like, my man, it's right in front of you. She has spelled it out for you and you are still failing the test. And so, yeah, as you said, what Fiammetta is blamed off often and portrayed as is what Sege is.
Yeah, they're fascinating foils of each other. Fiammetta and Sege both have very similar motives. Like, they both just want to enjoy themselves without consequence, but where Sege can kind of get away with it, Fiammetta can't because she is a woman. In fact, the story she shares about why she hates Fanta so much is like kind of emblematic of this carefulness and carelessness that she has to balance in her life. Like the very first time that she had a relationship with a man that was like sexually charged, she got pregnant, and that like kind of ruined her life. So she hasn't exactly put aside her dreams to have a kind of like a carefree, fun-filled life, whereas Sege gets away with it until Roman is like, nah, I'm out. Bags packed, out the door. Ring yeeted.
She's just like, nope.
I wonder if she was practicing that on the plane over. So smooth. The mic drop was brutal.
And he doesn't get it.
Yeah. Although in his defense, it's like, but Roman, she died for me. I can't just brush that under the rug, Roman. And Roman's like, then I'll brush you under the rug.
This is a really good thing for us, I think, to talk about, just this general conversation about both Fiammetta and Roman, because I've read a decent amount of reviews of this book now, and so many of them go, everyone is a full-fledged character except for the woman. And I think I came out of Oromay, like, initially upon finishing my read, I was like, I kind of agreed with that. And they don't get as much spotlight or time as I would like. That's just a, like, general part of it, is I think both of these characters are really well realized, and I just want more of them. And especially Roman is like, there's a scene at the beginning, there's a couple of telephone calls, and there's one at the end, and that's it. But Author-chan is actually thinking about this, or at least it feels like he's thinking about this in a way that, Sege is obviously not.
Another thing that, not just Author-chan, but also the women have a more accurate perspective on, or at least maybe like a closer perspective to, is like the very thing that the men won't shut up about, which is revolution and ushering in peace. Like the women have the most interesting and probably like politically complex things to say about why the men are actually here. Yeah, sure, to eradicate the insurgents, but also to like conquer the city. And the way to do that, at least the way that they are doing that, is through conquering the women. I mean, that's literally the term that Fiammetta uses. And then when Roman steps foot into the city, she's like, you're all so aggressive. Just leave a woman alone.
This book really pulls the revolution, but for who? Especially with those two. And I think even there's a moment where, like, Sega is like, and maybe in the future the woman can have more rights.
The irony too, though, because there's a moment, I think it's right before they really start heading out on the military campaign segment of this book, where they encounter like a tribe or whatever, wherein the women are like completely covered from head to toe, and all the men are talking about the ways in which these women are supposedly like super duper oppressed, and somebody says something to the effect of like, we should liberate them because that's what revolution is. Like, we need to liberate the women's. At the same time, that it might be Sege who's thinking to himself, like, I'd really like to know who these women are, and the only way to do that, I guess, is to like take their veils off.
Well, he's really asking, like, but are they hot? I think his, like, cameraman actually attempts to take one of their veils off, or is like trying to convince one of them. Sege literally has to drag this man away, being like, no, 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 do not do this.
Yet another thing that this book criticizes about the revolution, the organization, their aims, is that they're rather blind to the dissonance between their aims and their actions.
Coming back to this question of why so many reviewers and even myself had like that initial read of Fiammetta and Roman in this, is that, at least for me, and this is, I think, a thesis that still holds true even if they are also like fully fledged characters, is that both Fiammetta and Roman are representative of the parts of the nation that they come from, and they act in almost a metaphorical way to Sege, with Roman being like the heart of Ethiopia, Addis, and then Fiammetta being Asmara and Eritrea. And this really comes through in that final. So Roman shows up at Fiammetta's funeral. She's standing off to one side watching, and he approaches her afterwards, and we get this little exchange where she says, "Your heart went into the grave with her," she says. "Isn't that true?" He thinks of Fiammetta's words. "Will you remember me? Always? What kind of woman am I? You're a moron, I swear." He doesn't have it in him to betray Fiammetta again. He doesn't want to. "Yes, if you say so," he tells Roman. "So she will always be in your thoughts for the rest of your life?" "Roman, I'm sorry she sacrificed her life to save me. Of course I will remember her. What else can I do for her? I'm not going to join her in the casket." "But part of you is in there with her," Roman says. "What good to me is a heart that's half buried, only half here?" And then she drops the engagement ring and leaves his ass in the cemetery.
Like a literal mic drop.
So cool. I love her. But I think that's very telling of also how these characters are sort of being used, which is to say that in experiencing Asmara and experiencing the Red Star campaign, and also becoming disillusioned with the Red Star campaign and the Derg, what is happening here is not just a moment between like these two characters, I think, but also sort of a metaphor of what has happened to Sege himself, where he has lost that drive and belief in like the Ethiopia that he left at the start of the novel, and he's now more sort of attached to Eritrea and Asmara. And this is true, as far as we know, also of Baalu Girma, who stayed on after the Red Star campaign failed. He stayed on in Asmara to work as a journalist because he loved that city so much and seemingly just could not return to Addis afterwards.
In light of all of this, according to what these women have to say of what very little like time they are afforded in the sea of men in this book, what do women have to say about not just the Red Star campaign necessarily, but the revolution, the whole revolutionary project, and the peace that they're trying to usher in? And then, do they have anything to say about what revolution and peace should look like?
I'm sure I have an answer. I'm going to let you start us off and then maybe try to work my way into something that I believe in and not just something that comes to me.
We've already covered in broad strokes what the women, namely Fiammetta, who's the one who's plays witness to all of this, think like the revolutionary project, which is to like winning over the hearts of the people. And what Fiammetta sees this to be is rather a campaign against the women. And then whatever peace it is that they're trying to establish, as we've kind of touched upon, is a peace that excludes women. What Fiammetta has to say about the actual aims of the campaign can lead us in the direction of an answer to what do women, namely Fiammetta, think should be the quote unquote victory conditions of this campaign. And I think it's very simple. I think Fiammetta says it best, literally in like one sentence. And she says, "But since the revolution, we dress how we like and then we go out. That's definitely a sign of peace and prosperity when women start dressing up and going out on the town." And then Sege responds, "You're right, and it's getting better." She responds, "Oromay. Better now that we have Red Star. There's so much goodness now that every place is crowded with Heartlanders. Yeah." She's being sarcastic. So, very simply put, peace has been succeeded when the most vulnerable population, which in this book are women, can walk in public without fear, can live their lives without fear, can live the lives they want to live without being concerned about harassment. And according to Fiammetta, the Red Star campaign has not ushered in that kind of peace. Things have quote unquote gotten better since the most brutal days of the revolution, but by no means are women safe. It's a disingenuous peace, the illusion of peace, which in some cases is more insidious than the blunt image of war, the blunt fear of war, where nobody is safe and they all know it. But now that the Red Star campaign is ushered in the peace they're trying to build, like more and more people are becoming blinded to the ways in which they're failing the most vulnerable population.
I think it ties rather well into a conversation or thought that Sege has, where he says that we are different than the European forces that have colonized us in these ways. Like we are supporting the people in these different ways, and we are like better than external colonizing forces. But what the Red Star campaign is, quite literally, I suppose, is a effort to colonize Asmara and Eritrea and bring it under Ethiopian occupation in a way that Sege never seems to recognize. And Fiammetta does, right? Where it's like the revolution was good. You guys then decided we have to come in and be occupiers. And then that's where sort of a sense of failure seems to come from.
I want to go on a little tangent before moving on about women in romance. So much of this book is dedicated to Sege's love life, as well as you described, the sort of Cold War thriller aspects. And I think it's fair to say that love, romantic relationships, and women are all intertwined subjects. There's not much distinction between them. So I'm curious, why include romance?
It is one thing to tell a history of an event, it is another to tell the story of the people that lived through it. And while Oromay is not necessarily a non-fiction account of that, to include something like love, to include relationships, to include this web of people that are all sort of mixed up with each other, not always in ways that they want or in ways that they chose, is to include the reality of a city or a place and a time. And so maybe it's a bit of a broad answer, but it adds credence, I think, to the idea of this as being a truthful recreation of a moment, even if it's fiction, is to show how people exist under revolution or under occupation. Is to go like, life doesn't stop.
Yeah, much like when Sege goes to sleep. Life does not start and end with Sege's waking hours. I'll add to that that I think, despite there being many subjects that this book discusses, you know, for the very reason that you just described, like life is more complicated than any one theme, I do think there are two central subjects which serve as the umbrella subjects for everything else, and that is revolution and love. What is revolution according to this book, or rather, what characteristics do revolutions have? And then, like, what about love? Revolution may be the prerequisite for peace, but it is the opposite of it. If peace is like safety, calmness, sort of tolerance, revolution is the opposite. It's very dangerous. It's the very not calm. It's very passionate, and it's also intolerant. Like a lot of revolutions spark because the populace is intolerant of something, usually some ruling, governing bodies thing. It's like taking a snow globe and shaking it up. And I think in this book, so is love. Love does not behave in the ways that it should. It does not promote peace. And I think that is emblematic in Sege and Fiammetta's relationship, also Sege and Roman's relationship. The kind of romance that they have is not nice. It's not a nice, calm love, as you know, a lot of love stories produced in the contemporary era like to assert.
Just adding into that, I think the fact that his relationship with Fiammetta is like new love is really important into that space of like, drawing parallels between it and revolution, even if both women love him and he loves them in different ways. I think that relationship, especially being like new love or fresh love in face of like new revolution and new change and the new campaign.
Now, what I find interesting is that this book suggests that those who love, and especially those who love life, have no real place amongst revolutionaries, the best of whom are the soldiers who sacrifice their life. Maybe because they love life. But if Sege, as the author asserts, is a character who like really loves life, often to his detriment, that's the sort of person who needs to survive, and the person who strives to survive makes for a really bad revolutionary, at least in this book.
I think I generally agree, especially if we want to pull it back to Colonel Wolde and also his soldiers, in which we get there's a moment when Wolde basically asks all of his soldiers to write a letter to someone before they all go off to the battlefield. One of the things that Sege does is he talks to a lot of the soldiers and asks, hey, like, can I see these letters that you're writing? And he gets all of these different fragments. And those fragments are collected in the pages of Oromay with like, a line or two. And we see all the different reasons and all the different feelings and the ways of existing. Some are confident that they're going to die. Some write as if they will see, the person again soon. And it's all of these different experiences, but they all acknowledge that there's a possibility, I think, that on the battlefield anything can happen and they might not be coming home. And Walde is most interesting here still in that as the person that, at least to me, seems most clear-eyed about revolution and about change and about like his belief in what the Derg are striving for, is sort of like the perfect revolutionary in some ways. And I'm starting to wonder whether his choice to go to his death at the end is also a death of the revolutionary dream.
Yeah, to respond to that, that was one of my theories about why this book, despite being pretty tame in its criticism of the Derg, was, under such scrutiny. And like, this book is sort of about the death of the old guard, one could say. Separately, you bringing up the scene where the soldiers write their letters makes me change my mind about, the revolutionary and loving life. I think maybe in light of that scene, it is not necessarily that the revolutionary does not love life, but rather that the revolutionary loves life, just not their own. Because I noticed an interesting distinction between the soldiers and the directors and their staff members like Sege. Sege comments very early on that like everybody's just too busy to settle down, find a woman, love her, get married, have children, produce future generations. In theory, most revolutions are about changing society for the future. Maybe not for the benefit of future generations, but like, the future generations are going to live in the society that they're currently trying to build. And yet, the characters who describe themselves as being the primary holders of that responsibility are not producing the next generation because the very revolution, at least the revolution that they have in their heads, demands that they don't. And yet the soldiers do. Like all the soldiers have some kind of family. Maybe not necessarily wives or children, but like they all have family members. So again, maybe I'm just beating a dead horse here, but the soldiers are foils to the government officials, wherein they are actually the ones doing the work of the revolution, not just on the ground, but even like uh, outside the battlefield. Like they're the ones who are having the families who will live in this world that they're creating.
And I mean, this is maybe the irony of like the best revolutionary is both the one that has to like continue on for others, but is also being fed into the meat grinder. Well, at least in this case, the Derg are like basically feeding the next generation into the meat grinder. And I think even Sege says it. He's like, like all of these young men were willing to die for us, for the dream. But it's like if you lose that generation, and we know, historically that things do not go well for Ethiopia past this point either, that like the dream of the revolution dies with these men on the sides of a hill that wasn't worth taking.
Yeah, Oromay.
Oromay.
Oromay. That's it. So then, what was your favorite part of this experience? Slash, what makes you think this was worth covering?
Start with favorite part, which is that. Oh no, am I going to have multiple favorite parts?
That's fine.
Maybe. We'll start with the big one, which is that Oromay, for its historical weight and for its positionality in like Ethiopian history and Ethiopian culture, is astonishingly both readable and enjoyable. Like just as a book, it is a really good experience. And maybe it's the cynical part of me that was like I don't know if a book that holds such weight, and it is, as far as I can tell, in Ethiopia, it's considered like one of their masterpieces. I think I come to masterpieces with a certain sort of cynicism of, like, clearly you're doing something right, but like, are you also enjoyable to read? And this was a great read.
Yeah,
Like,
like, are you Joyce or are you normal?
yeah. And honestly, it's just like a really well told Cold War thriller, is basically what it feels like. And I think knowing the history and knowing about Baalu Girma and all of this makes it a much more rich experience on top of that. But you don't need any of that to go into Oromay and really enjoy it. I think I'm also the sort, and this leads into sort of my second thing that I really enjoyed about it, which is maybe a little bit of a cop out, but we'll just go with it.
Do it.
Which is that it is a book that inspired me to understand what it is written in. It inspires a desire to like understand the history, understand the culture, have a at least a rudimentary grasp of what was the revolution, why did it happen, what were the after effects, where does this lead to, what is Ethiopia like now because of that.
Yeah, real quick, just to jump in. As I was reading this book, I was sitting in my boss's office for just a regular meeting, and he has this massive world map across his wall. It's awesome. And I remember my eyes just glazing over it, and I saw Ethiopia and Eritrea, and I'm like, hey, I know that name. I know that capital city. I'll never forget those names on the map.
And I'm a sucker for books that feel like the place that they are talking about is a real like experiential thing. Like both Addis less so, but Asmara certainly is a city that with Sege you come to like love.
Yeah, was it the coffee bar that did it for you?
It was definitely the coffee bar, which also holds the spy network underneath the urinal, I think, or the sink. Yes, um,
Yeah.
really funny. And then coming off of this conversation, I want to highlight the big piece, which is that like based on the reviews and based on my initial like feelings or like experience of this book, I was disappointed in the woman and in how they were portrayed and written about. But coming out of this conversation, that is totally switched in my head to a point where I'm like, okay, so there is a lot there. There's a lot that's going on, even with characters that are so limited in time, literally on the page. They're so like well developed and built out and thought about, and they are sort of the face of the people that the book, for the most part, doesn't have time to include. They are the face of like the people that are actually going to be affected by everything that is happening, because it's not going to be the people in power. So yeah, those are my like big three. Sorry, but yes, I will return the question to you. Favorite parts, either about the book or about the experience of the book.
Yeah, now is my turn to apologize because I also have three, and they are basically in the reverse order of what you
Oh
just.
no.
So, I really liked the way that Fiammetta was written, and although I was really nervous about how they were going to conclude her character, I could tell that she had a complexity to her that the narrator in those moments, namely Sege, just could not access. And that Fiammetta herself was like, I think, also putting up barriers. Like you said, she's very careful. Um, but it was when I hit Fiammetta's letter that not only were my fears assuaged, but like I really decided to love this book without caveats. Although in light of our conversation, like the caveat is the soldier. But as I was reading it, I really liked Fiammetta's letter. I really liked how Baalu Girma very cleverly managed to give Fiammetta a voice that was not filtered through a man's perspective by just reading out the letter. like not through Sege's perspective, just writing it out. And it gave me also, okay, shamelessly, it gave me Silent Hill 2 vibes. It gave me the vibe of Mary reading out. I think she actually read out a letter, like reading out her letter to James. Uh, yeah, sorry to spoil a decades old video game.
You have no idea what's coming in the recommendation.
Motherfucker. Foreshadowing. Anyway, that was my favorite part of Silent Hill 2. So when I started reading Fiammetta's letter and got those vibes, like I just like nostalgia forced me to love this book. The second thing that I really liked is the way that this book balances simple, plain language with all the complexity of its historical context. There's lots of places I could point to, but my personal favorite moment of balancing the simplicity with the complexity is whenever they talked about uh, international influences. Like, there's so many country names, ethnic groups, cultural movements that are just tossed into this book as relevant context, which really asserted that, even though this is a Red Star campaign with a very, very specific focus, like none of this can exist without international cooperation. Like one of the running jokes of this book is that they're trying to get equipment from maybe Italy. They're trying to get equipment from, ironically, like another colonizing country.
Isn't it like straight up Britain?
It might be Britain. They're trying to get they're trying to get equipment that they need to record the military campaign with Colonel Wolde and everything from like one of the foremost colonizing countries. It's beautiful. I love that so much. But anyway, this book balances complexity with simplicity in a way that makes me weep for my own lackluster skills. Speaking of skills and weeping, I am a cynic when it comes to reading fiction. I will never get off my pedestal of I hate contemporary romance. What have they done? Austen rolls in her grave. But like, this is the sort of book that restores my hope in not romance necessarily. No, I'll never get off that pedestal. But it restores my hope in fiction that is entertaining yet deeply political. I think it's a really hard balance to strike. So yeah, I also would 10 out of 10 absolutely recommend this book. What are we going to cover next? Give it to me straight, Doc.
So, speaking of Mary's letter from Silent Hill 2, we're going to be playing Signalis. Going to start with a little caveat to this, which I think in a lot of ways my choice should actually be Hollow Body, which looks really good, and I've played the demo and I really enjoyed it. It's like British cyberpunk Silent Hill. It's got everything that I would ostensibly want. But while I do think we should cover it, and I do recognize that Signalis is the sort of indie darling that has inspired paragraphs on Tumblr, and also some of the best fan art for any game that I have ever experienced.
Yes, Tumblr, the last refuge of true journalists.
Kind of true, though, especially for like Heaven Will Be Mine. Like I was looking for scholarly writing on that, and I was like looking in the wrong place. Google Scholar and JSTOR was not the
Tumblr's
place.
like, I gotcha.
Tumblr got me. But while I say that, like we definitely should cover Hollow Body, I'm gonna be that person who's just like, I just like Signalis more. I think Signalis fucking rocks. I've played it once, but it was such an experience, and I think I played it. When did this come out? Hang on one second. 2022. I played it when it came out in 2022. It has sat in my head for 3 years. I adore this game. Have I replayed it? No. Have I got all the endings? No. That's the feeling side of things. But for the purposes of the podcast, for the purposes of us talking about it, What got me recently, as I was going back and I was reading developer interviews about Signalis, this is a two-person indie team that made this, and there's an interview. I think it's Waypoint, which is Vice's old games journalism side, where the interviewer asks, Signalis wears its influences on its sleeves, but looking back on the project now, how successful do you think it is at forging its own identity separate from those things? To which Yuri Stern, one of the two developers on it, responds, I don't know how to quantify such an identity. Essential question of Signalis is what is the worth of a replica, copy of a copy? What does it mean to exist primarily in reference to something else? I think that's up to each player to decide for themselves. Does the strength of art lie in how well it pretends to exist in a vacuum? As soon as I saw that as a question, I go, okay, but now I want to answer it. Now I want to talk about references and copies and replicas. But we'll save that for the discussion. What I think is worth doing is actually pitching what the fuck this game is, because I've kind of missed that completely. So let me do that real quick. Signalis, as I said, is a 2022 game. It is a survival horror that clearly takes influence from Silent Hill. I would say specifically Silent Hills 1 through 3.
The only good Silent Hills. Now I'm see. I look at you, the room. I look at you. You did your best. You tried.
4 was pretty fucking good, but fair enough. I would also argue that it is like the truthful successor to Silent Hill in a lot of ways, and I've been thinking about Silent Hill a lot recently because I've been playing Silent Hill F, and while I deeply enjoy that game and think it is doing a lot of things that I want from Silent Hill, this is where it's at. Signalis is where it's at. So, TLDR, survival horror game in which you play as an android known in this universe as a replica. His name is Aster, who is like crash landed on a moon, I believe, and is diving into the facility on it in search of her partner, a Gestalt named Ariane Young. And so it is.
Wait a minute. Wait. Young spelled J-U-N-G?
Nope, it is Yeong, but I am certain there's a connection. And one of the part returning to references and why I think this is an important text in some ways to look at is that one of the earliest items that you pick up in this game is a copy of The King in Yellow by Robert W. Chambers, who was a huge influence for Lovecraft. But that is one of the first things that you find, and from then on it is this dreamlike construction of moments and experiences as you search through this facility that is changing around you. As I said, I adore this game. I adore it aesthetically, musically. I am the sort of person that bought the vinyl collection because it was beautiful, and the music is haunting.
Hashtag no regrets.
Absolutely no regrets. I would like to give these devs more money. But what I think is really fun coming off of Oromay is that the society in which Elster lives is one that is deeply propagandistic and authoritarian. And throughout the facility that you explore, you will be finding propaganda of the empire that created her. And on top of that, it has the aesthetics, like the retro sci-fi aesthetics of the Cold War, specifically like Soviet and German aesthetics coming through as well. So just in general, it's like, I'm just trying to justify the fact that like Signalis is really good and you need to play it and we need to talk about it, but also that it does actually feel like a good follow-on from Oromay. What do you think?
Well, I mean, what I think doesn't really matter because it is your turn. But I am excited to get the kick in the pants that I need to finally play Signalis because I've not played Signalis despite your begging. So now
For 3 years. I played it and I went, hey, Eli, guess what? Please play this.
And for 3 years, it has sat in my Steam wish list. Every time it goes on sale, I think, I'll buy that when I'm gonna play it. So I guess that time is now. The time has come, the walrus said. I'm excited. Genuinely excited because I've heard nothing but good things about it, but has that, convinced me to play it? No. It takes a podcast like this, which does what only journalists can hope to do, which is hold people to account. And by people, I mean me.
And just as an extra positive, it's only 10 hours long.
Which will take me 20, but you know what? That's a me problem.
Thanks for listening to this episode. If you're looking to follow us elsewhere, we're on basically every social media platform. Links in the bio. And if you're feeling really generous, buy us a coffee or a Ko-fi. We don't really know.